Norway is viewed as one of the leaders in renewable energy and has shown long-term thinking in its approach to energy. So how do you see Norway balancing its commitment to a decarbonised society and economic stability and growth? So the question really is, can the move to renewables be an economic opportunity for Norway?
Yeah, so that's of course one of the central questions also in the energy transition in Norway. We have an electricity system where we have around, in an average year, 99% of the electricity in Norway comes from hydropower. So our electricity system is already quite green. At the same time, we are among the world's largest exporters of natural gas and oil. And we have the challenges in terms of meeting obligation towards European Commission, where we linked our climate policy up to the European climate policy, where we will have to reduce emissions in the non-quota sectors with maybe 40 to 50% towards 2030. And that means that we need to decarbonize the transport sector. And the question you raise is one of the fundamental questions. How can we do the energy transition in a country for which the electricity system already is very clean? And we want to decarbonize the other sectors as well. And in a country like Norway, for which the economy depends a lot on the natural gas exports and oil exports, of course, it is reasonable to think that in a 20-year perspective, we need to transition that part of our industry as well. So the question you ask is highly relevant even for Norway, where the national energy system is already quite clean, around 67% renewable, when you look at the energy system in total. And it's clear that in a situation where we think that natural gas and oil will be less important and renewable resources more important, and at the same time we're going to decarbonize industry, decarbonize the transport system, and make our built environment much more efficient, there is a lot of business opportunities. But it's going to be hard to replace the value creation that comes out of oil and gas in a very short time. So the main challenge we are facing is how can we make sure that we get innovation, how can we make sure that the natural resources we have for renewable resources can contribute over the next 20 to 30 years to increase the transition of jobs into those type of sectors and also sustained value creation. But it's for sure the central questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So one of the concerns of transitioning to a zero carbon society here in the UK is the potential for a loss of jobs and increased poverty as the old energy industries are replaced with the newer green energies. So it's especially the case in the oil-dependent cities such as Aberdeen. So in what ways does Norway integrate social sustainability as it develops an environmentally sustainable society? How does it consolidate the welfare of workers in this transition?
Yeah, so this transition, it really hasn't been happening yet, and it's something that we will have to face as well over the next years. If you look at it, an industrial workplace in the traditional industry or in traditional services in Norway maybe have a value creation of 1 to 2 million kroner, while a job in the oil industry has a value creation for society of 10 million kroner. And it's clear that when you look at this situation and you want to keep up the sustained economic growth and you want to make sure that there are jobs for everyone, you need to create new industry, new services, new business based on the transition that has still a high value creation and the right number of jobs. And when you look at it, why would local communities in Norway be interested in building out, for example, wind power? Well, one of the main motivations would be to have local value creation, local jobs in this transition. And the same questions will come up when you look at the suggested new developments of offshore wind in the North Sea. One of the main motivations for a country like Norway to move into that kind of industry would be the possibility to create new industrial jobs around the construction of those offshore wind parks. You could say you have the same in the transport industry when you want to go from cars driven by combustion engines, diesel and gasoline. You want to move into batteries or hydrogen. It's exactly the same questions that arise. Will it be possible to create a number of new jobs, for example, in technology export of those technologies related to battery electric vehicle, hydrogen vehicle, or maritime transport with hydrogen? And well, when you look at history, society has always been able to make those kind of transmissions where you have disruptive changes in terms of technologies being phased out. But they haven't always been easy. So I think that's one of the main jobs for the policymakers, how to facilitate through policy these transitions where new jobs are created. And I think from policymakers' perspective, I think it would be important then to focus on the transition that are needed and that have a value that lasts for at least a decade. I don't think the future way to go would be to subsidize the industries that are on their way out. It would rather be to spend those government support on the new industries that we're going to build.
Okay. Has there been any specific policy in Norway for to protect workers from oil and gas as they transition into renewable? Has this begun?
This has not begun at the moment. In fact, I think if you look at Norwegian oil and natural gas exports, they are almost at the peak level or just beyond the peak level. So this is an industry that have many years still to live if you look at the current policy. And I think that it's an industry that will recruit new working labor for many years to come. And that's of course one of the highly uncertain and risky parts of this situation. It would be how long could you wait until you make this transition faster. So if you look at some of the future scenarios, they will claim that there is a place for the oil and gas industry all the way towards 2050. If you look at the scenarios that are related to the 1.5 degree and the opportunity to actually enforce climate policy in such a way that this target would be achievable, it's not that clear that oil and gas will have that great future. And this is one of the dilemmas that we need to face over the next 10 years is how to deal with this transition. When we look at this in our studies, we see that natural gas could have a role in the European power system and industry and heating system towards 2050. But unless technologies like, for example, carbon capture and storage comes in place, the further you go out in time, the less likely that there will be room for those type of emissions in the system. So that means that there is a time window, let's say 10, 15 years, where you could implement technologies like carbon capture and storage and build capacity on that. That would make it possible to still have room, for example, for the fossil fuels in the energy system. So one Norwegian strategy would be to promote value chain for carbon capture and storage. That would make it possible to use natural gas at a much higher level in the horizon from 2035 to 2050 still. So that would be one way of manage to keep value creation from the natural gas sector. At the same time, it's very clear that society is transitioning more and more towards renewables. And most likely from a Norwegian perspective, one would need to look at how to develop offshore wind resources in parallel with that to be able to sustain the economic growth.
Okay, thank you. So one of your research areas is looking at the challenges that Europe faces as it moves towards a renewable energy structure. So can you maybe explain some of the challenges that Europe faces with this?
Yeah, so if you look at European policy, it's clear that it's ambitious in terms of reducing emissions in the EU ETS quota system, where the power sector is part of that quota system. It's 43% of the emissions that are going to be reduced by 2030, and it is clear that the power sector will play a substantial role in that transition towards 2030 and beyond. It's also clear that the subsidies used on wind and solar has been highly efficient, and we are approaching a renewable share that probably will be above 30% in 2030. And the question that people ask, which is a relevant question, is how high could that renewable share be before the intermittency? So the properties of the renewables, that means that you cannot plan it. The wind is blowing, the sun is shining at times that are not that predictable in the long run. And the major question that you face is, what kind of backup solutions would you need to make sure that supply equals demand when you have a very high renewable share? And some of the solutions that has been put on the table to solve, I think that's one of the major challenges in the transition. And some of the solutions that has been put on the table is more active consumers. So let energy consumers play a more active role in the transition. So that's maybe one of the challenges we are facing, how to facilitate processes where the consumers could play a bigger role in the energy system. I mentioned already carbon capture and storage technologies. That's seen as one of the solutions where you could keep natural gas power plants still running because you capture the exhaust, the CO2 in the exhaust, and make it environmentally friendly. A third challenge would be in that horizon, what do you do with the European heating system? In Norway, we have mostly electric heating. In many European countries, you have heating based on natural gas, where the emissions from natural gas happens locally. Or you have centralized heating, where you also have today emissions from the heating system. To make the transition of the European heating system into a zero-emission system is going to pose tremendous challenges, either by making it possible to use hydrogen or natural gas with hydrogen mixed in as the fuel in a heating system, or building infrastructure for electrification of the heating system. In addition to this, you have the question about energy poverty, where in some countries in Europe today, there is a shortage of energy. Even if it is not a requirement that power should be clean, there is still a shortage of poverty in many countries. And those countries are facing the challenge of providing enough electricity to their citizens. And the additional constraint that it is going to be clean is of course imposing even more difficulties and challenges for those countries. Yeah. So if you look at those lists of quite substantial challenges, I think that gives a good picture on what Europe is facing, and I think there are some side constraints to this. Europe would also like to keep up the economic growth, and it's important to keep the security of supply. And I think you see that that European policy today is as much oriented towards the security of supply and sustain economic growth, in fact.
Okay, thank you. So Norway has aspirations to become the green battery of Europe. Now, I think the question really means it's about this idea of the super grid and how we need to have political cooperation in order to operate in a cross-European setting, I think.
The nice characteristic of Norwegian hydropower is that we have large reservoirs where hydropower basically can be scheduled, so we can produce electricity from hydro dams when prices in Europe are high, and the Norwegian hydropower would come in a situation where there is too little electricity available in the market. And we could do the opposite. We could hold back Norwegian hydropower when there is a surplus of wind power and solar power in Europe, not flooding the market with hydropower at the same time. So that would be an efficient measure in order to balance out the supply and demand in the European power markets. And the factor you pointed at, the Norwegian capacity to do this, it's around 50% of the hydropower reservoirs in Europe. The capacity of the hydropower reservoirs in Europe to do this kind of balancing is in the Norwegian hydropower reservoirs. So it's a substantial part of the flexibility in the European hydropower system is in these huge Norwegian reservoirs. And one could imagine a future where you would build what you call pumped hydro. So that would be that you have reservoirs at different heights where you would produce power from one of the reservoirs, let the water down to a lower level reservoir, and then pump the water back up in the higher level reservoirs through tunnels. And in that respect, you could make that flexibility available again and again, of course, at an efficiency loss, but still a quite efficient system for energy storage. So you would use the power from Europe when power is cheap to pump hydropower back up in the higher level reservoirs and use the resource one more time. To do this would require quite a lot of drilling of tunnels in the Norwegian mountains between these dams. It would require building more cables to Europe in order to utilize this potential fully. And I think if this would happen over the next 10, 15 years, it would be because Norway and the neighboring countries would have a joint interest of sharing the costs and the risks of making those tremendous investments. Already today, the Norwegian hydropower system is one of the major sources of flexibility into the European power system. But that capacity could be increased. But that would, in my opinion, require market designs or corporations that go beyond what we see today in order to make it attractive for both parties.
Okay, excellent. Now, wind power is becoming increasingly important for Scotland. And can this allow Scotland to also play a role in stabilising Europe's energy systems as it transitions? So this would be Scotland's part in the European energy project. How important is the wind power? I know it's inconsistent with wind. You know, you have power at times and then downtime.
Yeah. So the nice things about wind is that it tends to blow at different times in different places of Europe. So if one would be willing to support the increased wind power capacity in different regions of Europe with more transmission, so a European large-scale transmission grid where you could move energy geographically. It would be quite attractive to have wind power located in different locations in Europe that have this property that the wind is blowing at different times. We have been doing some studies of the North Sea region, and we see that the wind properties in the North Sea region are quite attractive when you link them up to the countries that are neighboring the North Sea region. You could imagine that you build an infrastructure in the North Sea, for example, linking Scotland and Norway and Belgium and Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands, together with large offshore wind power plants. So that kind of facilities would, even if it is still intermittent and unpredictable, have two very nice characteristics. One of them would be that the wind blows more often in this region, so it has a higher availability capacity, while the wind generation in a typical European location would maybe be 25 to 30% of the installed capacity in the wind power plant. In that region, it might get up to 60%. So in that respect, more efficient. And the other nice characteristic of that region is that it's possible to link it up to these different geographical locations that I mentioned. That makes it flexible in terms of transporting the power to the location where it's most needed at any time. also making it more valuable. You have the same feature when it comes to onshore wind. For example, in Scotland, if you would build large infrastructure that would be able to transport that power to the rest of Europe, so that's transmission grids basically, you would have many of the same properties that you see in the North Sea. But what our studies show is that if you would have an increased cooperation in the North Sea region on offshore wind, that would probably be one of the more attractive regions in Europe to build large joint infrastructure and large joint offshore wind parks.
Excellent. Okay. So the next question is, how is Norway tackling the development of technological change that is required to facilitate the decarbonised strategy?
Yeah, so Norway is in a position where we are going to do emission reductions up to around 40% in the non-quota sector. For all practical purposes in Norway, that means that we have to decarbonize the transport sector, let's say 10 years before the rest of Europe. We are seeing that already with battery electric vehicles, where the penetration is much higher in Norway. So our estimates based on the research is that if we are going to succeed with this political ambition on climate gas emission reductions, we probably need to have most of the person transport zero emission by 2030. So that's a tremendous challenge that would require most likely both battery electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, and biofuels in the next 10-year perspective. So it's clear we are developing a strategy for how to build the necessary infrastructure to deal with this challenge. You asked earlier a question about how can we get new jobs based on this development, and I think that's going to be a central question when you're going to do this transition a few years before the rest of Europe. Could you create also new industry based on this transition? I think for Norway there is a tremendous potential in the maritime industry to start decarbonizing also the coastal transport, near coast maritime transport over the next 10 years. That's a part of the transition where we will probably do it also a few years ahead of some of the neighboring countries. And that could give us a competitive advantage if you're able to create new industry based on this. So that's an opportunity for Norway to let climate policy and environmental policy go hand in hand with industrial policy. In fact, I still think it would be fair to say that this policy needs to be developed, but it's one of the areas we are looking into.
Okay, and it's the last question just now. So the UK attitude to energy has been criticised for being a short-term approach to energy, especially with the way it works with oil and gas. What would you say are the main differences between the Norwegian policy of energy systems and the UK?
Yeah, so the fundamental difference between the Norwegian energy system and the UK energy system is that we already are at a renewable share of around 67% in Norway, and this has not been the case in the UK. So while UK have made effort to clean up the power industry by phasing out coal and focusing a lot on that part of the policy, this is something we didn't have to do in Norway. And I would say that when you look at that part of the UK policy, it has been long-term and it has been consistent, and it seems to be working. And then, of course, that leads to the next challenge. How do you replace that polluting power production from the coal industry with new clean energy? And I would say that the attempts that the UK has been making on offshore wind, being an early mover on offshore wind, seems also to be part of a long-term strategy. From my personal view, I would have liked to see a convergence of Norwegian and UK policy on that area, both being North Sea countries and both having great natural resources in terms of wind resources. And I would say what is maybe missing in both countries' policy at that area would be how to jointly develop the resources in the North Sea to be provider of clean energy into into Europe. So in the most optimistic scenarios that we have been looking at, you would have offshore wind production when we get closer to 2050 from the North Sea area of some 800 terawatt hours. So that would be an installed capacity that is 3 or 4 times higher than the Norwegian hydropower capacity. If this capacity is not built in the North Sea region, it needs to be built in mainland Europe somewhere. And one could argue that the resources are both better and there is more space available in the North Sea. And I think what is missing in UK policy and Norwegian policy in that area is common. It's the cooperation perspective, where you would be able to look into joint efforts, and that's true also for all the large lifts that you need to do in terms of infrastructure development. You could say, I mentioned already carbon capture and storage as one of the technologies that could be part of the solution. That would also require major joint efforts between neighboring countries to build infrastructure for transport and storage of carbon capture and storage. You mentioned initially that Scottish wind power could be a valuable resource. Well, if that's going to be a valuable resource for the rest of Europe, you would need to build transmission lines going all the way back down to Europe, and that would also need to be joint European efforts. So I would say that maybe more serious than the lack of national policy is, or at least equally important, is the lack of joint policy across the national borders. So joint cooperations between countries like the UK and Norway on the large infrastructure.